Chapter 37. The Trap. For more than a month, or from a few days following the night on which she had seen her father talking with Dave Singleton, Ruth Hamlin had been aware that her parent was acting strangely. There had been an interval, directly after that night when he had told her about his talk with Lawler, when Lawler had offered to help him to regain his place among men, that Hamlin had seemed to go straight, as he had promised. During that interval, he had taken her into his confidence many times to discuss with her the new prospects that the future seemed to offer and to renew his assurances to her. It had seemed then that there was hope for him. Of late, though, a change had come over him. He no longer confided in her. His eyes were beginning to take on again the expression of guilt she had seen in them in the old days. His glances at her were no longer direct, but furtive, as though he feared she might learn something of his actions should she meet his gaze. In the old days, Ruth had passively endured the shame that Hamlin's crimes had brought upon her. They had been so unexpected that they had stunned her. They had been so miserably mean that she had not dared to take anyone into her confidence. However, the days of passive endurance were over. Lawler knew, and Lawler had helped her father, and now she was certain her father had again fallen. She steeled herself against pity for him, determined that she would not stand idly by and watch him betray Lawler. She did not know what she intended to do or what she could do to prevent the stealing of the Circle L cattle, but she determined to watch her father, hopeful that she might devise some way to prevent the thefts. She had passed many sleepless nights, having become aware that her father was habitually absenting himself after nightfall, but she had never been able to catch him in the act of leaving the cabin at those times. Though many nights she had purposely stayed awake, tonight she had gone to her room to lie awake on the bed, fully dressed. She had left the oil lamp burning, for Hamlin had been sitting at a table reading. She heard him get up after a while, saw the light flicker and go out, heard her father cross the floor and go to his room. There was a fire in the kitchen stove, for the weather during the day had been cold, and she could hear the embers crackling for more than an hour after her father went to his room. After that, there followed a brief time when she heard nothing. She drew a blanket over her, and its welcome warmth brought on a drowsiness to which she almost yielded. She was sure, however, that she would not go to sleep, and she lay there comfortably for, it seemed, merely a few minutes. And then a sound assailed her ears, and she started up, realizing that she had been asleep, for a chill had come into the air of the cabin, and she knew the fire had gone out. She sat up, breathing fast, and ran to her father's room. The bed had not been slept in, and she emerged from the room, her face pallid with resolution. Running to the outside door, she swung it open and looked out. Far out upon the clear, moonlit sweep of plains stretching toward Willits, she saw the shadowy figures of 2 horsemen. Moving swiftly, she went to the corral, caught her pony, saddled it, threw on a bridle, mounted, and rode after the 2 horsemen, urging the pony to its best efforts. The speed at which the pony traveled did not equal the pace of the animals ahead of her, however, and she steadily lost ground, though the night was so clear that she did not lose sight of the figures in front of her until they reached the shadows of Willits' buildings. She did lose them there, though, and when she rode down the dimly lighted street, she could see no sign of them. There was no one about, and she rode back and forth on the street, searching for Hamlin's horse, which would give her a clue to Hamlin's whereabouts. And at last, peering into a vacant space between 2 buildings, she saw Hamlin's horse, and another, hitched to a rail near an outside stairway. She got off the pony, threw the reins over its head, and ran around to the front of the building, into the light of some oil lamps that stabbed the semi-gloom of the street. The building was occupied by the Wolf Saloon. She knew that, and it was that knowledge that caused her to hesitate as she stood in front of it. But her father was in there, she was certain. She had recognized the horse that had been hitched close to her father's as one that Singleton had ridden to the Hamlin cabin on several of his visits, and the cold determination that had seized her at last gave her courage to swing the front door of the saloon open. She hesitated on the threshold, white, shaking with dread, almost afraid now that she had come this far, to face the terrible men she knew she would find inside. The ill fame of the place was notorious, but while she hesitated, she heard her father's voice, a sound that drove her to instant action, for it was high-pitched and carried a note of anger. She went inside then, no longer thinking of herself, her heart athrob with concern, courage of a high order sustaining her. She pushed the outside door open, burst through the double swing door that screened the barroom from the street, and stood in the front of the room blinking at the lights. The room was full of men. She did not know how many. They made a great blur in front of her, and it seemed to her that all their faces were turned to her. She had a flashing view of a multitude of inquiring eyes. She noted the thick haze that hung over the room. Her nostrils were assailed by mingled odors that were nauseating. The flashing glance showed her the long bar, a cluster of lights overhead, card tables, a low ceiling, and a stairway leading from the barroom to a platform. All sound had ceased with her entrance. She saw her father standing near the center of the room. He was standing alone, in sinister isolation. Singleton was facing him, about a dozen feet distant. A few feet from Singleton stood another man, dark of face, with cruel lips and eyes that held a wanton light. A little farther away, close to the bar, stood Gary Warden. Her father seemed to be the only man in the room who had not seen her. A terrible rage had gripped him. He seemed to have undergone a strange transformation since she had seen him last. That manhood which she had thought had departed from him appeared to have returned, for he made a striking figure as he stood there. He was rigid, alert. He seemed to dominate every man that faced him, that stood within sound of his voice. He had been talking when Ruth entered. He was still talking, unaware of her presence. His voice was pitched high. It carried a note of defiance. It was vibrant with passion. Fascinated by the change in him, Ruth stood motionless, listening. "So that is what you brought me here for," he said, his voice shaking with rage. He was looking at Singleton and the man who stood near the ladder. "You brought me here because you wanted to be sure there'd be enough of you to down me. Well, damn you. Get going." His voice rose to a screech of awful rage, and while it still resounded through the room, he dropped his right hand and dragged at the pistol at his hip. It was done so swiftly that Ruth could make no movement to interfere, and yet as swiftly as her father's hand had dropped to the holster at his side, the dark-faced man who stood near Singleton anticipated the movement. His right hand moved like a streak of light. It went down, then up again with the same motion. The air rocked with a crashing report, mingled with Ruth's scream of terror, and Hamlin's gun loosened in his hand. His knees doubled, and he tumbled headlong, to fall face down at the feet of the dark-faced man who stood, sneering, some blue, white smoke curling upward in mocking laziness from the muzzle of his pistol. Ruth had moved with the report of the pistol. She was at Hamlin's side when he fell, grasping one of his arms, and she went down with him, to one knee, dazed from the suddenness of the thing, palsied with horror, the room reeling around her. How long she knelt at her father's side she did not know. It seemed only a second or two to her when she raised her head and looked around with dumb, agonized grief at the faces that seemed to fill the place. Then she heard Warden's voice. He spoke to the dark-faced man who had killed her father, and his voice was vibrant with a mocking, satanic satisfaction. "You've wanted her, Slade. Take her." The dark-faced man grinned at her beastily. She leaped to her feet at the expression of his eyes and started to run toward the door. But terror shackled her feet. It seemed that some power was dragging at her, holding her back from the door. She had not taken more than half a dozen steps when Slade was upon her. His strength seemed to be prodigious, for despite her desperate resistance, he lifted her from the floor, crushed her to him, and started for the stairs. She screamed, begging the men in the room to help her. But through the haze she saw grinning faces turned to hers, heard loud laughter and coarse oaths, and then came oblivion. Chapter 38. The Governor's Guns. From his desk in the big, quiet room in the Capitol building, Lawler could look out upon a wide sweep of orderly landscape. There were trees, now stripped of their foliage, in serried array around the spacious grounds that surrounded the building, bushes arranged in attractive clusters, a low stone fence with massive posts that rose in simple dignity above white cement walks that curved gracefully toward the streets. For nearly 2 months, the huge building representing the seat of government of a mighty state had been Lawler's throne, and he had ruled with a democratic spirit and with a simple directness that had indicated earnestness and strength. There had been a massive detail which had required close attention, many conferences with the prominent men of his party, in which the prominent men had been made to understand that Lawler intended to be governor, in fact as well as in name, and a gradual gathering up of all the loose ends of administration, which had become badly tangled through the inefficiency of the former incumbent. And now the legislature was in session. Lawler had not been able to seize time to visit the Wolf River section. Work, and more work had confronted him from the moment he had taken the oath of office on the Capitol steps until this minute, when he sat at his desk looking out of a window at the bleak, artificial landscape. There had been times when he had longed for a glance at the Wolf River section, and there had been many more times when he had sat where he was sitting now, thinking of Ruth Hamlin. Something lacked. He was not satisfied. In the old days, when he had visited the Capitol and had entered the State Building to sense immediately the majesty of it and to feel the atmosphere of solemn dignity that reigned within, he had felt that any man must experience the ultimate thrill, the tingling realization that he stood in a spot hallowed by the traditions of the Republic. The thought of serving the people of a great state had thrilled him mightily in the old days. It still thrilled him, but it brought with it a longing for Ruth to share it with him. Thoughts of Ruth this morning brought Gary Warden into his mind, and he frowned as a man frowns who watches a pleasant scene turn into tragedy. Only his collapse as he faced Warden that day in the latter's office had prevented him killing the man. He had left the Dickman cabin lusting for Warden's life. The passion that had surged through his veins during the long ride to Warden's office had been the only force that could have kept him going. It had burned within him like a raging fire, and it had upheld his failing strength until he had sunk beside the desk with his passion unsatisfied. He had thought much of the incident during the days he had lain in the room at the Willits Hotel, and later, while convalescing at the Circle L. And he had been glad his strength had failed him before he did what he had set out to do. For while there was no doubt in his mind that Warden had been implicated in all the attacks that had been made upon him, he had no legal proof, except the confession signed by Lincoln Givens, that Warden was guilty, and now that he had been elected, he intended to keep silent regarding the confession. He hated Warden, but it was with something of the passion a man feels who treads upon a poisonous reptile that attacks him. He meant to be generous in the moment of victory. Those men, Warden, Perry Houghton, Hatfield, and the officials of the railroad company, had performed according to their lights, using whatever power and influence was at hand to gain their ends, but they had failed. Several bills now pending in the legislature would effectually curb the powers of those men and others of their kind, and he would see to it that there never would be another opportunity for that sort of practice. Lawler got up after a time and walked to one of the big windows where he stood for some minutes looking out. Then he returned to his desk, dropped into the chair, pulled open a deep drawer, and took therefrom a cartridge belt, completely studded with cartridges. Suspended from the belt were 2 ivory-handled pistols that had seen much service. They had belonged to his father. Later, he had worn them himself. In the days when his character had been in process of developing, when he had earned, with them, a reputation which had made him respected throughout the state, they were, he felt, symbols of an ancient time. The day was coming when men would ride the open range without guns, when the wearing of guns would bring upon a man the distrust and the condemnation of his kind. Law and order would supersede the rule of the gun, and the passions of men would have to be regulated by the statute books. He had brought the 2 guns with him upon the impulse of a moment. He would be away from the Circle L for at least 2 years, and he wanted the guns where he could look at them occasionally, for they brought into his mind a picture of his father as he had seen him many times wearing them, and they reminded him of days when he too had worn them, days that had a romantic charm all their own. Chapter 39. Slade's Prisoner. When Ruth regained the use of her senses, she was lying on a bed in a small, evil-smelling room. An oil lamp burned upon a little stand in one corner. A door, the only one, was closed, locked. She saw the stout wooden bar in its sturdy side slots. At first she thought she was alone, and with a hope that made her breathless she lifted herself, swinging around until her feet were on the floor, intending to leap to the door, open it, and escape. A sound arrested her, a chuckle, grim and sinister, in a man's voice. She flashed swiftly around, to see Slade sitting in a chair near the foot of the bed. He was bending forward, his elbows on his knees, his knuckles supporting his chin, watching her with a wide, amused grin. For a long, breathless space she looked at him, noting the evil light in his eyes and the cruel, bestial curve of his lips. She saw how his gaze quickened as he watched her, how he had drawn 1 foot under him, obviously to be used as leverage for a rapid leap should she try to reach the door. "It ain't no use, ma'am," he said. "You're here, and you're going to stay for a while." He got up and walked to the door, placing his back against it and grinning widely as he looked down at her, as she yielded to a long shudder of dread. During the silence that followed Slade's words, Ruth could hear faint sounds from below, the clinking of glasses, the scuffling of feet, a low murmur of voices. She knew, then, that they had brought her to a room above a saloon. The Wolf, she supposed, for that was where Warden said he intended to bring her. She watched Slade fearfully, divining that he meant to attack her. She could see that determination in his eyes and in his manner. He was still grinning, but now the grin had become set, satiric, hideous. It was a mere smirk. No mirth was behind it, nothing but passion, intense, frightful. She glanced swiftly around, saw a window beyond the foot of the bed with a ragged shade hanging over it. She knew the Wolf was only 2 stories in height, and she felt that if she threw herself out of the window, she would suffer injury. But she meant to do it. She got her feet set firmly on the floor, and was about to run toward the window, when Slade leaped at her, seeing the reckless design in her eyes. She had been moving when Slade leaped, and she evaded the arm he extended and slipped away from him. She heard Slade curse. She was almost at the window when he rushed at her again, and to keep him from grasping her, she dodged, bringing up against the farther wall while Slade, losing his balance, plunged against the window, crashing against the glass and sending 1,000 broken fragments tinkling on the floor of the room and into the darkness outside. She was alert to the advantage that had suddenly come to her, and she ran lightly to the door and tried to lift the bar. She got one end of it from a socket, but the other stuck. She pulled frantically at it. It finally came loose, with a suddenness that threw her off balance, and she reeled against the bed, almost falling. She saw Slade coming toward her, a bestial rage in his eyes, and she threw herself again at the door, grasping it and throwing it wide open. She tried to throw herself out of the opening to the stairs that led straight downward into the barroom, but the movement was halted at its inception by Slade's arms, which went around her with the rigidity of iron hoops, quickly constricting. She got a glimpse of the room below, saw the bar and the men near it, all facing her way, watching her. Then Slade drew her back and closed the door. He did not bar the door, for she was fighting him, now fighting him with a strength and fury that bothered him for an instant. His strength, however, was greater than hers, and at last her arms were crushed against her sides with a pressure that almost shut off her breath. Slade's face was close to hers, his lips loose, and his eyes were looking into hers with an expression that terrified her. She screamed once, twice, with the full power of her lungs, and then Slade savagely brought a big hand over her mouth and held it there. She fought to escape the clutch, kicking, squirming, trying to bite the hand, but to no avail. The terrible pressure on her mouth was suffocating her, and the room went dark as she continued to fight. She thought Slade had extinguished the light, and she was conscious of a dull curiosity over how he had done it, and then sound seemed to cease. She felt nothing, saw nothing, heard nothing. She was conscious only of that terrible pressure over her mouth and nose, and finally she ceased to feel even that. Chapter 40. Primitive Instincts. Shorty and a dozen Circle L men, among them Blackburn and the 3 others who had been wounded in the fight with the rustlers on the plains the previous spring, had been waiting long in a gully at a distance of a mile or more from the Hamlin cabin. Shortly after dark they had filed into the gully, having come directly from the Circle L hours before. They had got off their horses to stretch their legs and to wait, and now they had grown impatient. It was cold, even in the gully where the low moaning, biting wind did not reach them, and they knew they could have no fire. "Hell," exclaimed one man intolerantly. "I reckon she is a whizzer." "Looks a heap like it," agreed Shorty. "Seems if Hamlin couldn't get him headed this way, like he said he would, he ought to let us know." "You reckon Hamlin's running straight now?" inquired Blackburn. "Straight as a die," declared Shorty. "If you'd been trailing him, like me and the boys has, you'd know it. Trouble is that Singleton is holding off. A dozen times we've been close enough to catch Singleton with the goods if he'd do the brandin', but he don't, and Hamlin has to do it, with Singleton watchin'. We framed up on him a dozen times, but he lets Hamlin run the iron on him. Hamlin eased that bunch into the gully just ahead, especial for tonight. I helped him drive 'em, and Hamlin said that tonight he'd refuse to run the iron on him, making Singleton do it, and then we'd catch him doing it. but I reckon Hamlin slipped up somewheres. It ain't none comfortable here. With that wind whinin' that vicious, complained a cowboy. And no fire, Hamlin said 10 o'clock, didn't he? It is past 11. It is off, I reckon, said Shorty. Let's fan it to Hamlin's shack and say something to him. Instantly the outfit was on the move. With Shorty leading, they swept out of the gully to the level and rode northward rapidly. When they came in sight of the Hamlin cabin, there was no light within, and the men sat for a time on their horses, waiting and listening. Then, when it seemed certain there was no one stirring, Shorty glanced at the horse corral. Instantly he whispered to the other men, "Something's wrong, boys. Hamlin's horse is gone, and Ruth's pony." He dismounted and burst into the cabin. Looking into the 2 bedrooms, he came out again, scratching his head in puzzlement. "I don't seem to sababe this here thing, boys. I know Ruth Hamlin ain't in the habit of wanderin' off alone at this time of the night, and Hamlin was tellin' me that he sure was going with Singleton. It is a heap mysterious, and I've got a hunch things ain't just what they ought to be." He turned toward the plain that stretched toward Willits, far out, a mere dot in his vision. He detected movement. He straightened. His face paled. "Somebody's out there headin' for town. I'm tackin' a look. The boss would want me to, and I ain't overlookin' anything that'll do him any good." He leaped upon his horse, and the entire company plunged into the soft moonlight that flooded the plains between the cabin and Willits. The ivory-handled pistols were still on Lawler's desk when his secretary softly opened a door and entered. The secretary smiled slightly at sight of the weapons, but he said no word as he advanced to the desk and placed a telegram before Lawler. He stood, waiting respectfully as Lawler read the telegram. It was from Morton. "Governor Lawler, there is something mighty wrong going on in Willits. Slade and his gang struck town this morning. He was with Warden all day in the Wolf. Don't depend on the new sheriff." Lawler got up, his face paling. He dismissed the secretary and then stood for several minutes looking down at the pistols on the desk. They offered a quick solution of the problem that confronted him. At this minute he was conscious of one thing only, that Slade was in Willits. Slade, who had led the gang that had killed his men. Slade, whose face haunted Blackburn's dreams. The man the Circle L outfit held responsible for the massacre that day on the plains above the Big Valley. Lurking in the metal cylinders of the 2 weapons on the desk was that death which Warden, Singleton, Slade, and the others deserved at his hands. He took up the pistols, nestling their sinister shapes in his palms, while his blood rioted with the terrible lust that now seized him, the old urge to do violence, the primal instinct to slay, to which he had yielded when Shorty told him of the things Blondie Antrim had done. Another minute passed while he fondled the weapons. Twice he moved as though to buckle the cartridge belt around his waist, shoving aside the black coat he wore which would have hidden them. But each time he changed his mind. He knew that if he wore them he would use them. The driving intensity of his desire to kill Warden Singleton and Slade would overwhelm him if he should find they had harmed Ruth. The deadly passion that held him in a mighty clutch would take no account of his position, of his duty to the state, or of the oath he had taken to obey and administer the laws. While he silently fought the lust that filled his heart, the secretary came in. He started and then stood rigid, watching Lawler, seeming to divine something of the struggle that was going on before his eyes. He saw how Lawler's muscles had tensed, how his chin had gone forward with a vicious thrust, noted the awful indecision that had seized the man. As the secretary watched, he realized that Lawler was on the verge of surrendering to the passions he was fighting, for Lawler had again taken up the cartridge belt and was opening his coat to buckle the belt around him. "Governor." It was the secretary's voice. It was low, conveying the respect that the man always used in addressing Lawler. But the sound startled Lawler like the explosion of a bomb in the room. He flashed around, saw the secretary, looked steadily at him for one instant, and then dropped the belt to the desk, tossed the pistols into the drawer, and smiled mirthlessly. "Governor," said the secretary, "your train is ready." The secretary stood within 3 yards of Lawler, and before he could turn to go out, Lawler had reached him. He seized both the man's hands, gripped them tightly, and said hoarsely, "Thank you, Williams." Then he released the secretary's hands and plunged out through the door, while the secretary, smiling wisely, walked to the desk and, picking up the cartridge belt, dropped it into the drawer with the pistols. Chapter 41. The Cleanup. The Wolf Saloon was in a big frame building that stood at a little distance from the back of the street, with a wide open space on each side of it. Lights were flickering from some of the upstairs windows of the building when Shorty and the other Circle L men reached town. Shorty and his men had ridden hard, and they had seen a horse and rider halt in front of the building while they were yet a mile or so out on the plains. And when Shorty's horse struck the edge of town, Shorty headed him straight for the wolf, veering when he reached it and passing to the open space from which ran an outside stairway. The other men followed Shorty's example, and they were close at his heels when he slipped off his horse and ran around to the front of the wolf. Warden had come out shortly before. He was now in his office farther down the street, congratulating himself upon the outcome of the incident in the saloon. He had struck a damaging blow at Lawler. At a stroke, he was evening his score with the latter. Several other men had emerged from the saloon. When Shorty reached the front door, 4 men were just emerging, carrying another suspicious alert. Shorty halted the men and peered closely at the face of the man they were carrying. "It is Joe Hamlin," he said as he recognized the other's face. Shorty's eyes were glowing with rage and suspicion. "What has happened?" he demanded of one of the men. "Ruckus," shortly replied one. "Hamlin here tried to draw on Slade. And Slade. Shorty almost screamed the words. He straightened. His face grew convulsed, pausing on the verge of violent action. He heard Hamlin's voice. "Shorty." Shorty leaned over, straining, his muscles working, his eyes blazing. Shorty heard low words issuing from Hamlin's lips. "Slade done it, Shorty. And he has got Ruth. Took her upstairs. Shorty, save her. For God's sake." Shorty straightened. "Take this man to the doctor. He is hit bad." The words were flung at the 4 men, and Shorty was on the move before he finished. Blackburn and the others were close behind him when he burst into the front door of the saloon. The saloon occupied the entire lower floor. A bar ran the length of the room from front to rear. In the center of the room was a roulette wheel. Near it was a faro table, and scattered in various places were other tables. Some oil lamps in clusters provided light for the card and gambling tables, and behind the bar were several bracket lamps. There were perhaps a score of men in the room when Shorty and the Circle L men burst in. Shorty had come to a halt in the glare of one of the big clusters of lights, and his friends had halted near him. The giant made a picture that brought an odd hush over the place. He stood in the glaring light, a gun in each hand, the muscles of his face and neck standing out like whipcords, his legs asprawl, his eyes blazing with awful rage as they roved around the room, scanning the faces of every man there. The other Circle Lil men had drawn their weapons too, but Shorty dominated. It was upon him that all eyes turned. It was upon his crimson, rage-lined face that every man looked. He was a figure of gigantic proportions, a mighty man in the grip of the bloodlust. "You guys stand, every damned one of you. Don't move a finger or bat an eyelash. I've come a-killin'," he said in a low, tense voice. The words coming with a snap, jerkily, like the separate and distinct lashes of a whip. Not a man in the room moved, nor did their fascinated eyes waver for an instant from Shorty's face. "Where is Slade?" He shot the words at them. He saw their eyes waver for an instant from his, and they looked toward the stairs in the rear. The stairs that Ruth Hamlin had seen when, for an instant after throwing the door of the room open, she had glanced down to see the room full of men, all looking at her. The concentrated gazing of the men at the stairs told Shorty what he wanted to know. He spoke to Blackburn, throwing the words back over his shoulder. "Hold 'em right where they are. Damn 'em." Then, with a few gigantic bounds, he was at the foot of the stairs. In a few more, he had gained the top, where he pressed his huge shoulder against the door. It gave a little, enough to further enrage the giant. He drew back a little and literally hurled himself against it. It burst open, Shorty keeping his feet as the wreck fell away from him, and he saw Slade, with a hand over Ruth's mouth, standing near the foot of the bed. Evidently, Slade had been about to release Ruth when he heard the door crashing behind him. For at the instant Shorty emerged from the wreck, he saw that the girl's body was already falling toward the bed as Slade drew away from her and reached for his guns. They came out, both of them, streaking fire and smoke, but they never came to the deadly level to which Slade sought to throw them, for Shorty's guns were crashing at Slade's first movement, and the bullets from the outlaw's weapons thudded into the board floor, harmlessly, and Slade lurched forward, almost to Shorty's side, his guns loosening in his hands and falling, one after the other, to the floor. He grinned with hideous satire into Shorty's face as he tried vainly to steady himself. "Warden, the damn skunk, said Lawler would come first," he said, with horrible pauses. He lurched again, still grinning satirically, and slumped to the floor, where he turned slowly over on his back and lay still. Shorty glanced at Ruth, who was huddled on the bed. Then he wheeled and leaped for the stairs. Before he reached the bottom, Ruth sat up and stared dazedly about. She had heard the crashing of the pistols, though the reports had seemed to come from a great distance, faintly, dully. But when she reeled to her feet and saw Slade lying on the floor, his upturned face ghastly in the feeble light from the oil lamp, she knew that someone had saved her, and she yielded momentarily to a great joy that weakened her, so that she had to sit on the edge of the bed to steady herself. It was not for long, and presently she got up and swayed to the door at the top of the stairs, holding on to the jamb while she looked downward. When her eyes grew accustomed to the light, she paled. In the big room were many men. She saw Shorty standing among them. She recognized them as Circle L cowboys. Shorty's guns were out. In fact, the men in the group near Shorty seemed to bristle with weapons. At the rear of the room was another group of men. They stood motionless, silent, and had no weapons in their hands. But some of them were crouching, their faces grim and set. And then Ruth heard Shorty's voice, hoarse, raucous with passion. "You guys that don't belong to Slade's gang, get out. Fan it. You Slade men stand. I know every damned one of you." There was a short silence, during which several men slipped away from the group at the rear of the room and bolted for the rear door. And then suddenly, as Shorty muttered words that Ruth did not hear, both groups of men leaped into action. Ruth saw the men in the group at the rear reach, concertedly, for their weapons. She saw smoke streaks stabbing the heavy atmosphere of the big room, heard the roar and crash of pistols, saw men falling to land in grotesque positions, saw Shorty, huge and terrible amid the billowing smoke, shoot a man who tried to leap over the bar so that he fell across it limply, as though sleeping. She observed another man, one of Slade's dodge behind a card table, rest his pistol for an instant on its top and shoot at Shorty. She saw Shorty snap a shot at the man, saw the man's head wobble as he sank behind the table, and then she was suddenly aware that it was ended. A ghastly silence fell. Through the heavy smoke, she saw Shorty standing where he had stood all along, near the cluster of lights just inside the front door. It seemed to her that the room was full of motionless figures of men strewing the floor. She was sick and weak, but she knew she must get out into the air, or she would faint, and so she began to descend the stairs, holding to the slender railing for support. She got down without anyone seeing her. No one seemed to pay any attention to her. As she reached a side door, opening into the space from which the outside stairs ran, she looked back to see Shorty and a number of Circle L men clustered around Blackburn, who was sitting in a chair, looking very white. She got out into the open and ran toward the street, hardly knowing what she intended to do. Whatever happened, she did not want to stay longer in the Wolf. She had a feeling that if she could find Morton, she would be safe until Shorty and the Circle L men completed the grim work upon which they were engaged. For she knew that the Circle L men had sworn to square their account with the outlaws, and knowing the circumstances of the fight on the plains the previous spring, she could not blame them for what they had done. And yet she wanted to get away from the scene, anywhere. She halted in front of the Wolf and saw a number of men on the street, and others running toward the building. She moved down the street toward the station, and as she passed a group of men, she saw a man running toward her, shouting loudly, "Lawler's here. What in hell is coming off? Lawler just got off a special train. He looks like he looked that day he rode into town looking for Gary Warden." Far down the street, Ruth saw him coming. He was running, and she leaped to meet him, unaware that Shorty and the other Circle L men had emerged from the front door of the Wolf and were listening to the man who had brought the news of Lawler's arrival. She was aware of nothing but the fact that Lawler was coming, and when, running toward him, she saw him stop dead short, she cried aloud with joy, "Oh, Kane, Kane!" And then his big arms went around her, and she nestled close to him, shuddering, sobbing, laughing, excitedly, rapidly, as he held her. She related the story of the night's adventure. Then Shorty and the others came up. She and Lawler were standing in front of a store, in a glare of light that came through a big window, and she saw his lips straighten when she told him what Slade had done. "Shorty," he said grimly, "take care of her. And then, despite her struggles, for she knew that he was going to seek Warden, she found herself a captive in the giant's arms, while Lawler ran down the street toward Warden's office. Chapter 42. Going East. Within 15 minutes after he had left Ruth Hamlin with Slade at the side door of the Wolf, Warden had sent a telegram to Lawler at the capital, informing him that the girl might be found at the brothel with the outlaw. He had signed no name to the telegram, but that did not lessen the venomous satisfaction he felt over sending it. It had been nearly 11 o'clock when Warden sent the wire, and allowing for some minutes of waste time before the message could be delivered, and the space of time that must elapse before Lawler could reach Willits. Even if he came on a special train, he knew that Lawler could not arrive before the early hours of the morning. Lawler, Warden knew, would be in a killing mood when he reached Willits. And he knew also that Slade would be waiting for Lawler, and that he would kill Lawler on sight. Slade would have to kill Lawler, for Lawler, as governor, had the power to be revenged upon the outlaw for the abduction of Ruth, and Slade would know that Lawler would use that power to the limit. If Slade killed Lawler, that would be another matter. The outlaw would have to hide to evade the clutches of the law. But hiding was not more than Slade had been accustomed to for years, and that necessity would work no hardship upon him. That was Warden's reasoning. Perhaps it was faulty, for it hinged upon the vagaries of a wanton character who could not be depended upon. But Warden had to take that chance, and Warden's reasoning of late had been influenced by his passionate hatred of Lawler. That hatred had warped his judgment until he had become a creature guided by the savage impulses that filled his brain. When he left Slade and Ruth at the door of the Wolf, he went directly to his office, taking Singleton with him. He lit a kerosene lamp, built a fire in the small stove that stood in a corner, seated himself in a chair, motioned Singleton to another, lit a cigar and smoked, his eyes gleaming with the vindictive joy he felt. However, the cigar in his mouth was not half smoked when from a distance on the steady west wind was borne to his ears the faint, wailing shriek of a locomotive whistle. The cigar drooped from his lips, and he looked swiftly at Singleton. Singleton had heard the sound too, for his eyes had narrowed, and his attitude had become tense. That both men had the same thought was evidenced by the glance they exchanged. Incipient apprehension. "It is a freight, likely," muttered Singleton. Warden took a nervous puff at his cigar. Then he got up, walked to a window, and stood, looking out into the night. He stood there for a few minutes, Singleton watching him, until the whistle shrieked again and a muffled roar reached their ears. Then Warden turned, his face ashen. "Singleton, it is a special," he said, jerkily, "an engine and one car." Singleton got up and walked to the window, beside Warden. As they stood there, they saw the train stop at the station. They saw, in the dim light from the coach, the figure of a tall man alight and dart across the platform, to vanish in the shadow of the station. Simultaneously, there came to their ears the staccato reports of pistols, the sounds rendered faint and muffled by distance. Singleton flashed around, his face pale and his eyes bulging. "It is Lawler. I'd know him among a million. And something's happened at the Wolf. That is where the shootin' is." "Warden," he said nervously, "it looks like there is going to be hell to pay." Warden's face was ashen, but he laughed. "Don't worry, Singleton. Slade will take care of Lawler," he said. But the words carried no conviction with them. They had been uttered without expression. Warden walked to the door and gazed down the dimly lighted stairway. There was suppressed excitement in his manner, nervous anxiety in his eyes. He walked back into the room, threw his cigar into a cuspidor, and stood with his back to the stove, listening. Singleton said nothing, though his lips had settled into a pout and his eyes had a sullen, malignant expression. He too was wishing what Warden was wishing, that Slade would kill Lawler. The death of Lawler would make the future safe for both of them. It would remove a menace to their lives and a barrier to their schemes for the autocratic control of the cattle industry. But they doubted. Deep in their hearts lurked a fear that something had gone wrong, which thought was suggested by the sounds of the shooting they had heard. Singleton had become afflicted with the nervousness that had seized Warden. The pout on his lips grew. He cast startled, inquiring glances toward the door, and at last, as they stood silent, looking at each other, there came a sound, close, the sound of a man walking in the street. As they listened, the sound came closer, reached the front of the building. Then they heard it on the stairs. Warden stiffened, and Singleton drew his gun. An instant later the door crashed inward, and Lawler stood in the opening, his eyes flaming with the cold wrath that had been in them on the day when, after he had killed Antrim, he had come to Warden's office for a like purpose. There was no word spoken. Lawler saw the gun in Singleton's hand. He leaped quickly to one side as Singleton pulled the trigger, the smoke streak touching his clothing as he moved. He leaped again as Singleton shot at him a second time. This time he was so close to Singleton that the powder burned his face, and before Singleton could shoot again, Lawler struck, with the precision and force that he had put into his blows that day in the schoolhouse. Singleton reeled headlong across the room, bringing up against the farther wall, striking it with his head and tumbling to the floor beside it. Then his lips set stiffly, his eyes flaming with a fire that brought terror into Warden's heart. He faced the other. "Now, damn you, I'll teach you to make war on women." He leaped forward, striking at Warden with terrific energy. Still struggling in Shorty's arms, Ruth heard Singleton's shots. She broke away from Shorty, noting with dull astonishment that Shorty seemed almost to have permitted it, and ran down the street toward Warden's office. As she ran, she heard a tumult behind her, and steps close beside her. She glanced swiftly over her shoulder to see Shorty beside her. The giant was taking steps that dwarfed hers, and while she looked at him, he drew past her. She heard him muttering as he passed. Caught his words. "Lawler ain't got no gun. I seen that." She ran faster than ever at that, and when Shorty reached the foot of the stairs leading to Warden's office, she was at his heels. There were other men behind her, a multitude. She felt them pressing close behind her as she ran up the stairs. But she did not look back, for she heard sounds of a conflict in Warden's office. The thud and jar of blows, the crashing of furniture overturned and smashed, the scuffling of feet on the floors, and screams of rage. In Warden's voice, when she reached the top of the stairs and looked into the room between Shorty's shoulder and the door jamb, she screamed with apprehension, for she saw Singleton, with blood dripping from a huge gash in his cheek, in the act of picking up a pistol that evidently had fallen on the floor during the fight that must have raged in the room. Singleton's face was hideous with rage. It was evident that he did not see Shorty and herself at the door, and that he had not heard the tramping of the many feet on the stairs. He was apparently oblivious to everything but the fact that the pistol was there, and that he had an opportunity to use it. Ruth saw Warden and Lawler fighting in a corner. Warden's back was against the wall, near the stove. He was facing the door. His lips were lacerated, drooling blood. His eyes were puffed and blackened, and he was screaming and cursing insanely. As Ruth watched, her gaze taking in the wreck of the room, and Singleton picking up the pistol, she saw Lawler strike Warden, a full sweeping blow that sent forth a sodden deadening sound as it landed. Warden sagged, his eyes closing as he slid to the floor, and sat in the corner, his legs doubled under him, his chin on his chest. The scene had held only for an instant, merely while Ruth screamed. The sound had hardly died away when Singleton succeeded in grasping the pistol. Ruth tried to squeeze past Shorty to prevent the tragedy that seemed imminent, but Shorty's quick, flashing motion checked her, made interference by her unnecessary. There was a flash at Shorty's side, and the crash of his pistol rocked the air in the room and the hallway. Singleton straightened, turned slowly, looked full at Shorty. Then, without uttering a sound, he pitched forward, almost at Lawler's feet. The roar of the pistol brought Lawler around so that he faced the door. He saw Shorty and Ruth and the others behind them, but gave no sign. His rage had left him. He seemed coldly deliberate. The only sign of passion about him was in his eyes. They were narrowed, and pinpoints of fire appeared to flame in them. As though there were no witnesses to what he was doing, he stooped, lifted Warden, and threw him over his shoulder. The crowd gave way before him as he started for the stairs, even Ruth and Shorty stepping aside to let him pass. They watched him wonderingly as he carried his burden down the stairs and out into the street. And then as he walked, they followed him. He went straight across the street, past some low buildings, and over a vacant stretch between the buildings and the station. The crowd followed him, Ruth and Shorty closely, silently watching. The special train in which he had come was still standing beside the station platform, the engine panting as though from its long run eastward. Ruth noted that the train crew was on the platform near the engine, interestedly watching the approach of Lawler carrying his burden. Lawler walked to the rear end of the coach and threw Warden bodily upon it. Then he turned and motioned toward the conductor. The latter approached him warily, seeming doubtful of what might be in store for him from a man who, though governor, thus carried the body of a man on his shoulder. But he listened respectfully when he observed the clear sanity of Lawler's eyes. "This man is leaving Willits." "Immediately," said Lawler. "He is going east to the end of this line. At my expense. When he regains consciousness, you will tell him what I have said." "It is Warden, ain't it?" grinned the conductor. "Well, I'll be glad to take him, but I'll have to wire for orders. This guy ain't a side bona fide passenger." He strode to the telegrapher's window. There was a short wait, and during the interval Warden stirred and sat up, swaying from side to side and staring about him in bewilderment. Lawler stepped forward, leaned over the platform. "Warden," he said, "you are going east. You are not coming back. If you ever step a foot into this state again, I will send you to prison for a term that will make you wish you were dead. I have a signed confession from Link and Gibbons that convicts you of a crime for which this state provides an adequate penalty. Do you understand?" Warden nodded wearily and dropped his chin to his chest. After an interval, during which the crowd watched him intently, he staggered to his feet and reeled into the coach, and the crowd saw him no more. An instant later, the conductor went toward the coach, grinning, signaling the engineer. A low cheer rose from the crowd as the train started, and a man far back toward the station shouted loudly, "If they hadn't been in such a damned hurry, we'd have raised a collection to send him to hell." A little later, Lawler and Ruth and Shorty formed the van of the crowd that walked down the street toward the Wolf, where the Circle L men had left their horses. Ruth walked between Lawler and Shorty. Ruth was very pale, and her lips were trembling. In front of the Willits Hotel, in the flood of light that came through the windows, she clutched at Lawler's sleeve. "Hurry, Kane," she begged. "They have killed Daddy." "Don't you believe it, Miss Ruth," said Shorty softly into her ear. "When I left Joe Hamlin, he was a whole lot alive, and getting more alive right along. I left Andy Miller with him, and Andy's got more sabbe of medicine than any doctor in these parts." "Shorty," she breathed, springing around in front of him and catching him by the shoulders, standing on tiptoe to do it. "Shorty, you don't mean it." Shorty laughed lowly. "I'm reckonin' to mean it, Miss Ruth." "But how?" she questioned, her hands still on his shoulders, her eyes wide and questioning. "How did you happen to go to the 2 bar?" "Well, you see, Miss Ruth," laughed the giant, while the crowd which had followed them stood off at a little distance and watched. "It was like this. Me and the boys, and your dad, had been trying for a long time to catch Singleton running iron on the Circle L cattle. Your dad and me had run a bunch into that gully near the 2 bar, and tonight me and the boys was waiting in the gully for your dad to bring Singleton there. Your dad had been branding stolen stock, at my orders, and tonight he was going to refuse, mocking Singleton do it, for Singleton was really doing the rustlin', and your dad was doing it all for you. Is that what you mean, Shorty?" "Why, I reckon, Miss Ruth, you see." Ruth had to leap upward to do it, but somehow the height was achieved. 2 arms went around Shorty's neck and Ruth's lips were pressed against his with a resounding smack. "Oh, Shorty," she exclaimed as she hugged him tightly, after kissing him, "I just love you." Shorty blushed furiously. As soon as Ruth released him, he grinned with embarrassment and walked with giant strides down the street to where he and his men had left the horses, the laughter and jibes of his fellows following him. Chapter 43. The Majesty of Peace. As upon another day that was vivid in his memory, Governor Lawler sat at his desk in his office in the Capitol building. A big, keen-eyed man of imposing appearance was sitting at a little distance from Lawler, watching him. The big man was talking, but the governor seemed to be looking past him, at the bare trees that dotted the spacious grounds around the building. His gaze seemed to follow the low stone fence with its massive posts that seemed to hint of the majesty of the government Lawler served. It appeared that he was studying the bleak landscape, and that he was not interested in what the big man was saying. But Lawler was not interested in the landscape. For many minutes, while listening to the big man, and answering him occasionally, he had been watching for a trim little figure that he knew would presently appear on one of the white walks leading to the great wide steps that led to the entrance to the building. For he had heard the long-drawn plaint of a locomotive whistle some minutes before. He had seen the train itself come gliding over the mammoth plains that stretched eastward from the Capitol, and he knew that Ruth would be on the train. "The proposed bill is iniquitous," said the big man. "It is more than that, Governor Lawler. It is discrimination without justification. We really have made unusual efforts to provide cars for the shipment of cattle. The bill you propose will conflict directly with the regulations of federal interstate commerce. It will be unconstitutional. We'll risk it, smiled Lawler. The Attorney General is certain of the constitutionality of the bill. We'll never obey its provisions, declared the big man, with some warmth. Lawler looked at the other with a level gaze. This is a cattle-raising state, he said. The interests of the state's citizens are sacred to me. I intend to safeguard them. You run your railroad and I will run the state. Previous railroad commissioners have permitted the railroad companies to do largely as they pleased. We are going to have some regulation that will regulate. The proposed bill may seem drastic to you, he added as he leaned forward, the better to look out of the window he had looked out of before, to see the trim little figure he had expected coming up one of the white walks. But if you fight it, we shall introduce others. The people of this state are pretty well worked up and are demanding legislation that will curb the power of the railroads. That will make impossible a situation such as existed under the regime of my predecessor. What would you say to a law that would compel you to construct grade crossings at every street intersection, along the right-of-way in every city and town in the state through which your railroad passes? The big man's color fled. He stared at Lawler. Also, went on Lawler, there is an insistent demand for electrification of railroads, especially from city governments. Then, too, there is some agitation regarding rates, both freight and passenger. But I want to be fair to go at these improvements gradually. Still, if your company insists on fighting the bill which is now pending, he paused and looked at the big man. The latter got up, smiling faintly. All right, Governor, we'll be good. I never really favored that deal, which almost set the state afire and made you governor. But my directors, they'll be sensible now, I hope. The big man grimaced. They'll have to be sensible. He extended a hand, and Lawler took it. The big man went out. As the door closed behind him, Lawler got up and walked to it, standing there expectantly. The door suddenly opened and Ruth stood in the opening. It was her first visit to the office, and the atmosphere of solemn dignity almost awed her. After a little, when she had seated herself in the governor's chair, from where she looked gaily at the big, smiling man who watched her, she got up and Lawler led her to one of the great windows. Father is much better, Kane, she said. In another week he will be able to ride. Your mother sent you her love, and Shorty told me to tell you to take care of yourself. Kane, Shorty actually loves you. Shorty is a man, Ruth. Oh, he is wonderful. And then, with a direct look at him, she added, Della Wharton has gone east. Kane. Lawler's eyes narrowed. He was silent. Ruth's voice was tremulous with happiness as she stood close to the man she had come to marry on the morrow, in the big house which was awaiting both of them, the governor's mansion. Kane, she said, I used to dream of this day. Tomorrow, I mean, but I never thought it would be like this, so terribly, solemnly happy. Lawler drew her closer to him and nearer the window. I wonder if you know how lonesome I used to feel as I sat at my desk there trying to look out over that great waste of world stretching between us. I know, she said lowly. I used to feel the same way. There was a time, right after you went away to begin your campaign, when it seemed to me that you had gone to the farthest limits of the earth. And now, he asked, smiling. And when she did not answer, he added, the world seems to have become very small. It is a wonderful world, Kane, she said solemnly. For a time both were silent, gazing out of the window. In the foreground were the bare trees of the Capitol grounds, the white, curving walks, the low stone fence with its massive posts, the broad streets of the city animated by traffic, the roofs of buildings. But straight down a street that intersected the broad thoroughfare skirting the Capitol grounds on the east, they could look beyond the limits of the city at the mighty level country that stretched into the yawning gulf of distance. Towered Willets, straight to the section of world which had been the scene of the conflict that had tried them sorely. It was a bleak picture, the plains dead and drear, barren of verdure, a dull, drab expanse of waste world with no life or movement in it, stretching below gray, cold clouds. But while they watched, a rift appeared in the clouds. It grew, expanded, and a shaft of sunlight pierced it, shimmering, glowing, touching the waste of world with a brilliance that thrilled them. It was evident that Ruth seemed to feel that the glimmering shaft was a promise of happiness to come, for when Lawler turned, Her eyes were shining with a light that caused his own to deepen with sympathy and understanding.